As with all of our presentations here at Royal Roads University, we begin by acknowledging that we live, learn, and work on the traditional lands of the Cosepsum and Lekwungen families. There has been a long legacy and continuing legacy of teaching and learning on these lands, and we are so fortunate and respectful of our place within that now. In the chat box, if you'd like to share where you're joining us from, please do. We are here today to chat about enrollment management, from theory to practice. So my name is Selena Kunar, and I'll be in the chat box helping answer any questions and navigating any tech challenges that may arise. But we're joined by some experts who will be diving into the content with us today, starting with Dr. Tamara Leary.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so very much for joining us. We're quite excited to share the next bit of time with you, talk a little bit about enrollment management, what that means, invite your questions, and offer some information on the courses and program that we are now very proud to be able to offer.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tamara. And we are also joined by Dr. Clayton Smith.
Hi, everybody. Clayton Smith here. Coming to you from Windsor, Ontario, where I'm a professor at the University of Windsor, and this is my first real dive in with Royal Roads, so bear with me. I helped Dr. Leary develop the certificate that we're going to learn a little bit about today, so I'd be pleased to answer any questions about that along the way. I'll turn it back now to Selena.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tamara and Clayton, for introducing yourselves to the folks on the call today. We welcome all of our participants. Please feel free in the chat box to let us know where you're joining us from, perhaps what sector or which part of the higher education sector you are currently working in, and what you're hoping to get from today's webinar. We'll be checking back into our chat box and welcoming everyone and reading your introductions. So please feel free to have those trickle in throughout our session. And with that, I will hand the microphone over to Tamara.
Thank you, Selena. I see some familiar faces and names from our Royal Roads community, which is awesome. Thank you so very much for taking the time to join us. And like Selena said, for those of you that may be from a campus other than Royal Roads, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. I wanted to offer a little bit of context as to, why SEM, why Strategic Enrollment Management, and why now? The method behind the madness, if you will, for developing the program, the certificate program in Strategic Enrollment Management, was again very much the recognition that SEM has long been a part of higher education operations. Institutions are very familiar with SEM. It's usually something that is institution specific. And the recognition that in Canada, we didn't, until now, have an actual academic credential that validated, acknowledged one's skills and knowledge in strategic enrollment management. So we saw a need there, and we set off, Clayton and I, to fill that need. And I'm absolutely thrilled and honored to have been able to work with Dr. Smith on this, given his expertise in SEM and his wealth of knowledge and experience in this area. Why now? Well, it was relevant before the pandemic, and if anything, the pandemic has made it that much more relevant, as institutions now have to step back and think about not only what they were doing around enrollment management, but what changes they may need to make, what adaptations to their plans in terms of managing their enrollment they may need to now consider as we look at more and more digital learning and work environment. What does that mean for enrollment management, and how can we get out ahead of this? How can we respond to this? So again, it was relevant before the pandemic, and if anything, that has heightened the awareness and the need for some skills, some expertise in leading our institutions through enrollment management, effective practices and approaches. So that's why we did what we did, and we're here to talk a little bit about it with you today. Next slide. And I want to thank Selena in advance for being our slide operator today. So we thought we would start, at the beginning. What exactly is Strategic Enrollment Management? Well, a little bit of history. This is, as you all know, not new to higher education. In fact, it's been around since the early 1980s. It evolved, I think, as something institutions found themselves doing, and folks starting to recognize the correlation between how they manage their enrollment from a prospective student right through to alumni was significant in terms of their operations, both from a tuition perspective, also very much from a student experience perspective, and also from an institution's reputational perspective. These are all things that are major components to any SEM plan. There are lots of definitions out there about SEM. There's less written in Canada. It is increasing. We have relied on our colleagues primarily out of the United States for the research and literature specific to SEM. We have had, and Dr. Smith has been pivotal in this area, contributions to Canadian higher education scholarship around SEM, and it continues to grow. The definitions that are out there continue to be tinkered with, given changes and trends and challenges that institutions face. But what I think still remains very true is that, regardless of what definition you're looking to inform your approach, the emphasis is always on enrollment management being a comprehensive process, something that is intentionally designed to effectively manage your enrollment at the institution, emphasis being on process. This is not something that one does and says we're all done and we give ourselves an A+ and move on. This is continuous. It is the song that never ends, and we're continuing to tinker with it as we need to. So I think it's very important to remember it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. It has to be institution specific, and we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly does that mean. And, it's something that we do need to learn from, not only from our own practices, but from the practices and experiences of other institutions as well.
Let me jump in here. These are some definitions, and I'm going to embellish a little bit if I can, Tamara. That's what academics do, right? These are from some colleagues of mine along the years. Mike Dolan's in the middle gives us this definition, that SEM is comprehensive, just like you were saying. It's designed to help an institution achieve and maintain its optimum enrollment. So the notion of optimum is going to be very institution specific, but where optimum is defined within the academic or instructional context. So before this time, we didn't ask those kinds of questions. We just had a number, if you will. But the idea here is that we need to fill the classes, and we need to ensure that students are successful as they go through the institution so that upon graduation, we have the right number of students. The second definition here is from Bob Bontrager, who also was quite influential in establishing SEM early on. And Bob says that enrollment management is a complex set of concepts and processes that enable fulfillment of the mission and the student's goals. So the switch became more apparent as we came into the 2000s, that it isn't just about recruitment, admission, financial aid, and orientation, which is where the early years put the focus of enrollment management. Because enrollment management was created because, if you will, the amount of kids coming out of the Vietnam era in the US declined. And Boston College was one of the first places that came to grips with that. And so rather than change the institution, they said, we just have to find more students that look like the students that we're successful with. And that's kind of how enrollment management began to take form, but it was very much the front end. And then Bob was able to kind of shift gears with that a little bit as we came into 2000 and say, it's got to be about student success, because that's what universities and colleges need to be about. And the last definition, Christine Curlin wrote, which we slightly modified recently, but it's about certainly comprehensive. You see that word there. You see coordinated, but now you see the word integration. And that is, no longer can admissions do what it does and financial aid do what it does and faculty do what they do. We have to find ways to bring these things together to create a coherent way to influence student enrollment decisions. And so those would be those definitions. Selena, you can go to the next slide. So here's the premise of SEM. It's that we must look at our enrollment health and sustainability throughout the entire student experience. So normally my animation jumps around a little bit here, but essentially it's, you can see the arrows take you from one to the other, but in reality, retention is connected to recruitment and marketing. Co-curricular support has everything to do with who we admit to the institution, all those kinds of things. So in reality, everything's connected to everything. And the key isn't that, the key is how it is that we connect these things together so that the student's experience is as dynamic and as expectant as they'd like it to be. And the phrase at the bottom here, well, if we could go back just a second, our current state of uncertainty and change affects every phase of the student experience. That's absolutely true. So what we heard earlier today from the US, and this is where you need to know I'm a dual citizen. So I did some of my education and my experience in the States and some of it here in Canada. But what was just announced today was the number of students who applied for financial aid this year has declined by over 100,000 students. And interestingly, those applications are going down in the areas of low income, marginalized populations, the very places that we wanted to grow, particularly as we talk about the Black Lives Matters and some of the other kinds of topics that are going on across the hemisphere. So I think the idea here is that we're going to have an access challenge. We know success has always been a player for us, the idea of student retention and student experience, those kinds of things. But now we have a layer of complexity here that we didn't have before. We have a pandemic. And some students are opting out. Some students are fearful of online learning. Some students just don't know what to do. And so we need to be really purposeful about how it is that we structure our enrollment activities to ensure that students get access to and support as they go through our institutions. And now we can go to the next slide. All right, here are the purposes of SEM, just a quickie run through here. SEM is about a data-rich environment. I can't talk about SEM without talking about data. And here in Canada, we struggle a little bit on the data side. Our institutional analysis offices are not as robust as they are south of the border. We don't really have a Canadian set of data to help guide our operations. Some of the provinces are quite good. Out in BC, where Royal Roads is located, has a pretty good set of data. But this is important. So we have to find ways to acquire the data to make the right decisions. And the added piece here is that supports strategic dexterity and identification of scenarios. So what we're talking about here is that we have to find data that's going to help us decide which directions to go and then to play out various scenarios. Jim Black of SEMWorks has been recently talking about the idea is that enrollment management needs to have a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and be able to shift as these various events occur. And he's absolutely right. The second one there is establishing clear goals for the number and types of students. Very important as we think about who we want to be as a campus or as a higher education sector. We have to think about not only enrolling those students who come to us with privilege, and there are a lot of those. Many of you represent that. I, like some of you, was a first-generation student. I had no idea how to negotiate what it was this post-secondary sector was to be. And so institutions need to be thinking about the different types of students. In Canada, we need to think in particular about Indigenous students. We need to be thinking about all sorts of different students. The third item here is promote students' academic success through access, transition, persistence, and graduation. Again, the idea here is SEM cannot be about just bringing people into the institution. And sometimes our senior administrators don't yet know that. And so it's going to be up to all of you to help them understand that SEM has some levers that are going to be helpful in bringing students success, educationally, personally, academically, as they go through the institution. The next one, promoting student and institutional success by assuring effective academic program planning. This is where the faculty really play a role here. My colleagues in my faculty of education, as an example, we might sit around the room and might say, gee, we'd like to have a program in this because we're interested in that. When that might have no relevance at all to the things that resonate with students. So we need to figure out ways to connect academic decision-making with, if you will, student demand. The next one, improving process organizational and financial efficiency and outcomes. The notion of efficiency, very important here. Sometimes we think about, gee, if we can have a better marketing program, or if we can have better publications, maybe a fancier website. But actually, when students touch the institution, we need to make sure they're able to do it in some very efficient ways. The next one is increasing communication and collaboration. It's all about communication. It's about communication with students, between faculty members and staff members and students, as well as those that influence students external to the organization. So communication and the way in which we do that is very dependent on collaboration. So those are the purposes of SEM.
A little bit in terms of theory that informs strategic enrollment management. And I think it's important that, you know, we stop to consider that there is a rationale, there is, and I overuse this phrase, but there is a method to the madness. There's motivators, there's a way to understand, to assess our current situation, but to also inform our practices. So these are three of the more, the theories that are commonly identified as informing strategic enrollment management. One being resource dependence theory. And so essentially what that refers to is institutions responding to the changes around them, the external environment. And the response is by shifting their resources, their strategies, the way that they invest their resources, and their intent is to be able to protect or potentially acquire resources they need to survive. So that's probably very much happening right now. It's in action as institutions are pivoting and responding to what they are now finding the situations they're now finding themselves in, driven very much by the external stressors and influences connected to the pandemic. Another theory, institutional theory. This theory talks about how institutions will often, or even units within institutions, will mimic others, those that they perceive to be effective processes and strategies outside of their institutions. And while there may certainly be informed practice there, some real gold nuggets, one has to be cognizant that each of our institutions are very unique, and we pride ourselves on being unique. We look for ways to differentiate ourselves from other institutions. So because of that, we need to be mindful that SM is not a one-size-fits-all approach to managing our enrollment. And then the last theory is new managerialism theory. And again, very similar to institutional theory, but the focus is on the adoption of different policies and practices, tools that tend to be traditionally more associated for the profit, from the profit business sector. So, you know, we as institutions in higher education have certainly tapped into or replicated what would be considered more business type strategies around marketing, around analyzing our data, the way that we use technology, our consumer resource management tools. And again, that's not to say that that's wrong. It's just to recognize that this is where sometimes we look for the answers, we look for best practices to inform how we approach enrollment management. So it's important to remember that, you know, there is theory, and you know, in the courses in the program, you would have opportunity to delve further into those theories.
Yeah, as you go through the course and the certificate program, one of the things that we'll be doing is kind of trying to turn you into scholar practitioners, not just practitioners, not just scholars, but scholar practitioners. And so being based in theory is an important way of thinking. It's an important way of approaching our work. So what I've got in front of you here is something called the SEM planning framework. The second of the courses, the enrollment management courses in the 3-course sequence, it will involve SEM planning. And so let me just share this with you. This is something that Christine Curlin and I put together for the ACRO Strategic Enrollment Management Conference, which is coming up here shortly. And so what you see at the very bottom and the bigger item is the strategic plan. It then flows to data, to goals, to key performance indicators, strategies, tactics, assessment, and eventually to sustainable enrollment outcomes. So the idea here is that these are the building blocks of how we do SEM planning. What's so important here is that everything gets connected to the strategic plan. We don't just kind of make this thing up in the registrar's office or the enrollment office or whatever office that you might be associated with. We have to have it connect largely to the strategic plan. And then these other pieces build on top of it. And then eventually we get to the strategies and tactics and measuring their performance. But where do most people start? They start with the tactics. They start with reacting to something that's going on in their environment. And all of us, like I just told you a few minutes ago, we have a little bit of access challenge. We're looking at, are we all of a sudden going to say, well, how do we change that? Well, that might not be the story you want to tell, because maybe at your institution, it's a different story playing out. But you won't know that unless you do the data analysis and you do the environmental scans, and then you say to the campus, well, what kind of goals are we going to have? And so on and so on, okay? So this is a good way to bring the theories together, if you will, in a practical way. And on the left, you see the two words there that I used earlier, strategic dexterity in multiple scenarios. The idea is that we need to be flexible. That is that this looks very linear, that I'm going to start with the strategic plan, and then I'm going to go to the data, and then I'm going to go to goals. But the reality is I'm circling around and I'm doing things backwards and forwards and sideways all the time. Again, perfect example, when the pandemic hit in March, we didn't just say, oh, we have to finish executing our SEM plan. No, we had to change it. We had to change the way we do things. So sometimes, and to some extent, we did it in a reactionary way at first for those 3 weeks of the final part of the semester. And now we've had 4 or 5 months to really plan it out, so that what the idea is that as we came to the fall semester, we should have a couple of scenarios in motion so that we know which ones to use as we go forward. And the item at the top, sustainable enrollment outcomes, all of these things are possible. We'll create the notion of a sustainable enrollment. Not any one of them, but all of them working together. Go ahead, Selena. I guess this one's mine too. So what Christine Curlin and I have begun to do, kind of like on a very practical way, is begin to kind of pull together some key words that we think really take you through the SEM process. And the first one there is link. And when I came into enrollment management in, God, it seems like forever ago, the 1980s, I was a director of admissions, and before that an associate director, and before that a student recruiter, and all those things. But we worked within our world. We worked within the admissions office, okay? And so I had an admissions plan, or the director had an admissions plan, and we executed it. But one of the things that we've learned since that time is, for instance, people just can't decide where to go to school based on an offer of admission. It involves, can they afford to go? So the financial assistance that they receive probably is a factor. Maybe it's about they're an athlete, and did they get connected? Were they recruited by the coach? Maybe it's about the academic program. Do you have that special academic program that the student really needs? Just because they've been admitted in and of itself is not sufficient to influence that student's decision. So the idea of how we link with these various players across campus is terribly important. The second one there is integrate. That is that we can't just operate separately. While we can link, we also need to integrate our processes. So as we're planning to bring students to campus, we need to be thinking that admissions doesn't stop at the point that students make the decision to come and, I don't know, orientation start the next day. The reality is there's transition from one to the other. And it may be those admission advisors or those enrollment advisors are present at orientation. And they're helping guide because they're the ones the students know. So wouldn't it be neat if they were actually present and helping with that process? And the last thing is extend. The idea here is that by integrating comprehensively across the campus, that we can actually increase our capacity, that we can become more than we would have been before. So link, integrate, extend equals SEM.
So to echo a little bit of what Dr. Smith has been talking about, in terms of, who is part of SEM and where does the responsibility of SEM actually rest? It involves many of many of the same stakeholders at different points in varying degrees, but again, using that word comprehensive and process and relationships and communication, these are all things that are critical to any SEM plan being effective. It is going to very much depend on working relationships and shared communication and shared data between these various stakeholder groups. And really, sometimes we think that SEM happens, if your institution has quarterly SEM meetings, for example, that SEM is happening that day from 10 to 12 in that boardroom, and then once you leave the boardroom, it's not happening, and that's not the case. That's a component, a part of any SEM plan, but in and of itself, it's not all of SEM. It's constantly happening, and it's tinkering, and it's moving, and yes, it's complex, but it's doable. And things that make it that much more doable are that transparency, clarity around who are we, what are we trying to achieve, what is our data? Are we effectively using our data? Do we know what we're collecting and why we're collecting it? Are we using it to inform our decisions, to inform our goals? And is what we are doing, is that aligned with who we are as an institution in terms of our vision and our strategic plan? All are paramount to the success of any SEM plan. So just a few of the stakeholders, and I'm sure we have representation from all of these areas. When we talk about SEM, first and foremost, the first students. The S stands for strategic. It could certainly stand for student. It's about not only getting the students. It's not only about recruitment and marketing. It's about how do we retain our students, and are we engaged in those conversations from a SEM perspective? What's happening in our institution? And a lot of those retention type initiatives do reside in what typically is housed as student affairs in any institution. We also think about our financial colleagues, decisions that are made around tuition, around refunds. Most recently, many institutions had to quickly think about what, if any, changes to tuition or refunds or student fees may actually need to kick into gear because of the pandemic. Well, those are decisions and conversations that have to be part of your larger SEM circle. What are going to be the implications from an enrollment perspective? What do we need to be cognizant of? Obviously, marketing and communications, pivotal to any SEM plan. Our faculty, Dr. Smith referred to academic programming. Academics can have all sorts of ideas about what they think the world needs, but it also needs to be have a reality check as to whether or not there is in fact a demand for that. Are we, and is it a demand that is growing? Is it a demand that is by the time we get a program out there, it'll no longer be relevant? Who's checking our currency of our credentials? Are we graduating students that have what they need to be successful in their respective areas. Our senior administrative leadership team and our senior academic leadership team. You know, quite often, certainly in any of the SEM work I've done with other institutions, that tends sometimes to be more a gap than it is a partnership. How do we engage our academic colleagues? How do we engage faculty in our in conversations and decisions pertaining to enrollment management? Institutional research offices, to Dr. Smith's point, not necessarily something that is as prominent in our college and university system here in Canada as it is in other countries. I think increasingly so. My experience has been there's never been a lack of data at any institution. What tends to pose the greater challenge is institutions are limited in knowing how to use their data, or even knowledgeable of what unit is collecting what data. And you know, is there duplication? Is there a way that we could be sharing that information to make informed decisions? And of course, our registrar, colleagues in our registrar are pivotal, central to what we do in enrollment management. So it does make for a challenging and complex process. But it's doable and it's evolving. And you know, again, you can't overemphasize the importance on clarity and communication and transparency and recognition of the role for each of these stakeholder groups in the larger process.
I guess this one's mine. This is a follow-up to what Dr. Leary was saying, is the importance of relationships. And so when I conduct workshops on SEM, and I'll probably be bringing this into the course as well, is we want to talk about what relationships you have and how effective you think they might be. So you might want to scan through this, but there are sort of typical departments on the left, and you would certainly want to replace some. Maybe you call them different things at your place, and ask yourselves, are my relationships non-existent? Do I know the people in that department? Are they weak? Are they less developed? Are they fair? Or are they excellent most of the time? Or you're just not sure why this matters. Okay? And what I'd like to kind of throw out to you at this stage is there's almost no department on campus that you ought not to be thinking about having a relationship with. But relationships are not from department to department. They're from people in the department to other people in the department. Universities and colleges operate in not a top-down sort of way, actually. Some people think, oh, it's the president that makes all the decisions, the key decisions, or maybe it's the deans, or maybe it's departments. But actually, most of the key decisions that are made by the people doing the work. We need to ensure that they are empowered as best they can through the relationships they have. So this is just a slide to help you think along those lines.
So we wanted to give you an opportunity via the chat box, you know, as to date, based on what you've heard, what sorts of challenges are you aware of with SEM, or have you experienced with SEM? If you could pop those in the chat box, we're going to talk a little bit about what external and internal challenges institutions can face.
Okay, so while you're populating the chat, let me throw out a few. And here are some external challenges, because some of the challenges we face in SEM are outside of the institution. So here's some: changing student demographics. We see that students, particularly in the pandemic, are operating perhaps differently than they have before. It could be on the basis of diversity, geography, it could be lots of things. They're swirling. And what we mean by this is they might start at institution X, but finish at institution Y, or return to institution X at some point. They're moving around. So what we know in Canada is that students largely finish. Here in Ontario, I can tell you more than 80% of the students who start in post-secondary education finish. But what I can't tell you is where. And that is that they might start at the college down the road, St. Clair College. they might finish at Wilfrid Laurier University, a short ways away, or maybe at the University of Saskatchewan, okay? So they're swirling, they're moving around. Adjusting program delivery modes, we're in the middle of adjusting delivery modes. I spent all summer reworking courses, helping to design the certificate courses here in a very blended and to some extent completely online sort of a way, and we're having to do that. The increase in underprepared students as universal education becomes more the norm in Canada, we're seeing students come who may not quite be ready. And so we have to think about how do we ensure that they are successful as they go through our institutions, while at the same time not lowering any academic standards. Fiscal pressures, government is a big player here. Many of us are seeing our tuition frozen. I remember in Ontario when we were doing international recruitment, the government decided to give us a little bit of a tax for every international student that we enrolled. So not only were they freezing tuition, they were actually reducing or adding cost, if you will. Shifts in global politics, absolutely what's going on, you know, in between, whether it's the current discussion with on trade relations between the US and Canada, between China, the discussions that we're having, what happened with our international students from Saudi Arabia. Lots of things are, yes, I've been always aware of that. Increased competition. There was a time in Canadian higher education where, you know, if you were within my county, Essex County here in Windsor, Ontario, no other university would come here, okay? And that is that I would be sure that if a student was going to an Ontario university from my county, most likely they'd be coming to me. That's no longer the case. Competition is seemingly everywhere and ramping up all the time. Focus on skills, labor market outcomes. Absolutely, government is talking endlessly in a sort of neoliberal sort of a way about where's the return? How do we ensure that the programs that we're approving are actually the ones that the economy needs? And then lastly on this list, regulators, communities, families, lots of people are asking the question is, what's the payback for going to higher education? It used to be that higher education was a value in and of itself. Now people are asking, do I need to go? When you have, I don't know, the Bill Gates of the world being extremely successful, yet being a Harvard dropout. And other stories like that pervade the public press, very, very real. Let's go to the next slide. And here are some internal challenges, and then we'll get to what you've written in the chat box. The things are not all external. There is this sense, certainly amongst senior managers, that it's all about what's happening out there. We just need to have the better website. We need to have better recruitment. We need to have more marketing. But actually, sometimes what influences students about whether to come to an institution or not is internal. And these are just some of the things. They might be a software system that may not be quite up to the task. It could be our own policies and procedures may not be as effective as we think. Our own various time to completion rates, the data that we've been talking about a little bit, relevance of our programs and the way we deliver them, the student services that we provide. For many years, I served as a vice provost students here at Windsor and doubled as the dean of students. And I can tell you that we ramped up student services in order to better meet the needs of certain student populations. Rising costs, yeah, I mean, these are things that we can control to some extent. And then lastly, pressure to respond to students' financial insecurity. So what kind of money are we putting out there in the way of bursaries, in the way of academic scholarships, and those kinds of things. So Dr. Leary, can we go to the chat box and see what's out there?
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of folks, thank you very much, have identified exactly the types of things you've been talking about. Certainly a disconnect between tuition for in-class versus online learning. There being some confusion confusion about what students are getting in terms of value. Other comments around the, one of the challenges being different departments and silos doing their own recruitment or engagement initiatives, but not necessarily taking into account the impact that that could have in departments. And an example shared around international recruitments, for example, if that's happening without any sort of connection or communication to other services, housing, academics on campus, that can be problematic. Sue shared that, another barrier, again, just emphasizing the importance of communication. There not being shared communication and the problems that that can create. And sometimes there can be too great a focus on KPIs, and where that might become the target, becomes a priority over the quality or best practices. So all comments reflecting very much what you've said. So critical questions for consideration, and these are just some of the things that as you start to, as an institution, whether it's within your unit or cross share unit, some of the things that you want to consider are what exactly are you trying to achieve here with strategic enrollment management. It's amazing sometimes when you ask that question to a group of stakeholders, the diversity of the answers. And it's very important that there is a shared understanding of what it is we want our strategic enrollment management plan to accomplish. What are we after? And it's not going to be the same for every institution. And it doesn't have to be grandiose. It doesn't have to be, moving mountains. It may be that the most effective thing for your institution right now are tangible bite-size goals to achieve and to build upon. What's informing your approach? Again, back to what Dr. Smith was talking about in terms of the importance of data, and accurate data at that, in terms of your institution's data, in terms of the labor market research and trends that are out there. Who exactly are your students? Do you have a clear understanding? Prospective, current, and your alumni. Sometimes alumni get forgotten about, and they can be such a critical component in terms of our recruitment and our reputation. Do you have the right stakeholders represented and engaged in the development and implementation and assessment of your strategic enrollment management plan? Dr. Smith's framework, at the very top, was assessment. And again, this is one that tends to get forgotten about. How do we know when we get there? Are we learning from things that we did that were successful? Are we learning from things that we did that we thought, in hindsight, nah, shouldn't have done that? That's all part of that comprehensive process that we've talked about. Next slide. Other questions, again, is your plan aligned with your institution's vision, mission, and strategic goals? And sometimes that's something that we all talk about, but we don't actually invest any effort into, and it is critical that we do, because that vision, mission, and strategic plan of the institution should be driving our institution, and we want a plan that's in alignment with that in order for it to be effective. And do we as an institution truly understand the full cycle in terms of our own students, our student enrollment cycle, right from prospective through to the alumni? Who are we interacting with? Who are the students interacting with? When? What is the message? What are the processes? So, one of the comments in the chat box about, the recruitment and the communication and making sure that each, everybody's on the same page. I recall recruiters at one institution I worked at packing up and setting up their display at a fair. Imagine their surprise when they toured the fair themselves and found 2 other booths from our institution that we knew nothing about. These are things that you wonder how it happens, but people get busy, they get in their silos, and unless there is a shared commitment to do this and to do it well and together as an institution, you're at risk of these one-offs happening and possibly compromising your enrollment management plan.
So this is really kind of what it comes down to, is SEM relevant? And I think that your senior leadership might ask this question. So here we're showing that SEM offers the tools for addressing many of the challenges that institutions are facing. And these are some examples of where the current disruption is impacting. Dislocation of students and institutional structures due to the pandemic, disruption of finances, utilization of technologies, and responding to social justice and socioeconomic factors. These are all things that SEM can have some part in helping the institution to address. Go ahead. So, and the idea here is that we're in an era, and I would call it changeful. So that's probably a new word, or not really a word, or something. But the idea is that we're in a changing world, and that I vindicated just a few of the ways in which SEM can help with the change that's there. But they're really just about being thoughtful, being collegial, being comprehensive, and all of the things that make for the key pieces of SEM. So it's all there, and it lays the groundwork for SEM planning and implementation. Go ahead.
So all of this to say, the graduate certificate program actually has 3 courses in it. The first one being HEAL 550's Systems Thinking and Strategic Planning in Higher Education. And you know, certainly while that course would be very valuable in terms of the systems thinking perspective, which is a large component of SEM thinking and planning, it's not a prerequisite for 580 and 585, which are the 2 SEM specific courses. So in 580, you are going to, students will spend a great deal of time on theory and practice, understanding the theory, the core concepts of SEM, having a good look at the challenges, some of which we've identified here today, and the strategies that are aligned with the recruitment and retention of students, and the different stakeholder perspectives of SEM. Dr. Smith will be teaching both courses, so I certainly, anything I can add should be added there. Dr. Smith?
Yeah, let me just jump in. There's basically 4 units in that class, and the first unit talks about the overview of SEM in North America, and there are going to be things about the landscape, the origins, the core concepts, use of data and technology, organizational models, how it plays out in different institutional types. The second unit talks about student choice and competition. We're going to go specifically into the student choice literature, admissions, recruitment, marketing, pricing, and financial aid. The third unit is on student persistence and retention. We're going to look at the persistence and retention of special population students and the role of institutions in increasing student success. And then lastly, we're going to take some time to reflect about all the different pieces of enrollment management and think about the ethics, the policies, the leadership, and the future of SEM in North America, and in particular here in Canada. So 4 different units in that class. Course moves along a pretty good pace. And just so you know, I like to do things both asynchronously and synchronously. So you should expect a few synchronous classes floating through here, in which case we'll bring in some experts from the field to complement the course instruction. Back to you, Dr. Leary.
And then 585, the actual strategic enrollment planning. So having the course give you the opportunity to analyze and be able to apply what you've learned in HEAL 580 to your own SEM plan. Having a look at in depth at the resources, the information that goes into a SEM plan. Dr. Smith, anything else to add there?
Sure, the same pieces I'll throw out there. In the first unit, it's 3 units in this one. It's a SEM planning overview. We're going to actually just give you a sense as to what's going on in SEM planning across the hemisphere, if you will. We'll then go in and talk about the various components, the influence of organizational structure, support on SEM planning, assumptions, situation analysis, how we develop goals and evaluation, all those kinds of things. And then lastly, how to implement the whole thing. And one of the things that we'll be doing here is that each of the students in this class will be writing a SEM framework. And that is something very real. So you'll find, again, this notion of scholar practitioner, which pervades my teaching. And that is, I want us to have a real solid touch of the literature. I want us to understand the operations as they're going, but I actually want you to emerge as someone who is immersed in the thinking, but also the ability to carry it through. So that's what this course is about. Back to you.
So I know that we're running close to time, so I don't want to spend a whole lot on this, but for those of you that might be interested, this particular grad cert and the courses within it are housed under the Higher Education Administration and Leadership suite of programs, which are all in front of you there. And if any of you have any questions, I see from some of the names we have current and past McHeal students, which is fantastic. Nice to see you. If you have any questions around that, I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith and Dr. Leary. So speaking of questions, well, we have reached almost the hour today. The three of us are happy to stay on and answer any questions that have come up for you as we move through the content we have today. So feel free, if some questions came up for you, to pop them in the chat box, as we're just around the corner from a question and conversation session. If you have any question about our graduate certificate in Strategic Enrollment Management, or either of the two courses that we've explored specifically, please contact our enrollment services teams. We have a few folks online who have been wonderful, Lisa in particular in our chat box, populating it with some helpful links. So if you're interested in chatting with Lisa and her team, you can find them at learn.more@royalroads.ca. And if you're joining internationally, our international team is happy to continue the conversation at learn.more.international@royalroads.ca. So with that, we have come to the close of our presentation portion of today's session. Looking at our chat box, I see many thank yous and folks signing off to head to their next meeting. I think all of us are experiencing the Zoom, where we're Zooming from one meeting to the other while staying in our seat the whole time. So if any questions come up for you post-webinar, or for any folks who are watching our recording, we welcome you to reach out to myself, Tamara, Clayton, or any of our teams on campus, as we're always happy to continue the conversation. We hope all of you have a great rest of your morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on when you're watching this recording. Bye-bye.